The rain hammered against the glass doors of the Meridian Tower, as 23-year-old Aria Valencia pressed her trembling hand against the cold surface, water streaming down her face. Her clothes clung to her shivering frame, and her voice barely cut through the storm as she looked up at the security guard. "Please," she whispered, desperation cracking her words. "Can I wash your dishes for a place to sleep?" But it wasn't the guard who heard her. Standing in the marble lobby, frozen mid-step with his briefcase still in hand, was Alexander Sinclair, billionaire, philanthropist, and the man who owned the building. The moment his steel-gray eyes met hers through that rain-soaked glass, something shifted in the universe, and neither of them would ever be the same. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of unexpected encounters that change everything, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Alexander had built his empire on reading people, on understanding their motivations, their desires, their fears. At 35, he commanded boardrooms, influenced markets, and lived in a world where everything had a price. But standing there, watching this stranger offer to work for nothing more than shelter, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine human connection cutting through the armor of wealth and status. The security guard, Marcus, was already shaking his head, reaching for his radio to call for assistance in removing what he assumed was another desperate soul seeking handouts. But Alexander's voice stopped him cold. "Wait." The single word carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that came from owning half the city's skyline. "Let her in." Alexander's tone remained calm, but his eyes never left the young woman outside. "Open the door." Her auburn hair was plastered to her head, and her green eyes held a mixture of hope and terror that made Alexander's chest tighten. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't her beauty that stopped him. It was the quiet dignity she maintained even in her desperate state, the way she held her shoulders straight despite everything. "I know this looks terrible, but I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can clean, cook, organize, anything you need. I just need somewhere safe to sleep tonight." Eyebrow that spoke of a story he suddenly wanted to know. Sometimes everything can change in an instant. His own life had been built on the ashes of such moments. The night his parents died in a car crash when he was 19, leaving him with nothing but debts and a failing family business he'd somehow turned into a global empire. Success had cost him relationships, trust, the ability to see people as anything other than potential threats or opportunities. "Marcus," Alexander said without breaking eye contact with Aria, "please escort Miss Valencia to the private elevator." "Sir, are you certain?" Everything about him spoke of power and control. The perfect cut of his charcoal suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known real uncertainty. Yet there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that suggested he understood desperation better than his polished exterior revealed. The penthouse doors opened to reveal a space that belonged in architectural magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the storm-lashed city, modern art adorning the walls, and furniture that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But Arya noticed something else. Despite all its beauty, the space felt hollow, like a showcase rather than a home. "It serves its purpose." He set his briefcase on a glass table, suddenly unsure how to proceed. In boardrooms, he commanded absolute authority. But standing here with this woman who had offered to wash his dishes, he felt oddly uncertain. "You mentioned you could cook?" The question slipped out before Alexander could stop it, more vulnerable than anything he'd allowed himself to say in years. State-of-the-art appliances still bore the subtle sheen of items rarely touched, and the refrigerator, when she opened it, contained little more than bottled water and what appeared to be expensive takeout containers. "It tells me you're successful, but lonely," she said quietly, running her fingers along the marble countertop. "This kitchen has never seen a family meal, never heard laughter over morning coffee, never been the heart of a home. It's beautiful, but it's empty." But hearing this stranger voice, what he'd never admitted to himself, felt like looking in a mirror for the first time in decades. It was recognition. Two people who had learned to survive by keeping others at a distance, suddenly seeing the possibility of something different. Someone who's built something incredible but lost himself in the process. A chance to prove that I'm worth more than the worst day of my life. A chance to show you that having someone in your space doesn't have to mean losing control. She said the job was too impersonal, that she felt like she was maintaining a museum rather than caring for a home. He paused, the admission feeling strange on his tongue. The position pays well, includes room and board, and requires someone who can handle confidentiality. You're offering me a job, just like that? The rest we'll figure out as we go, Arya finished, and her smile transformed her entire face, making Alexander realize just how beautiful she truly was. That first night, as Arya settled into the guest quarters, a suite more luxurious than anywhere she'd ever lived, she found herself staring out at the city lights, still hardly believing her circumstances. 12 hours ago, she'd been sleeping in her car, having lost her apartment when her roommate disappeared with the rent money and her job at the marketing firm had ended in budget cuts. Pride had kept her from calling her family back in Oregon, and her savings had evaporated faster than she'd thought possible in an expensive city like Seattle. Meanwhile, in his master suite at the opposite end of the penthouse, Alexander lay awake listening to the subtle sounds of another person in his space. The soft footsteps, the distant sound of running water, the barely audible hum of someone who sang unconsciously while getting ready for bed. For the first time in years, his home felt alive. Following his nose, he found Arya in the kitchen, moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared what appeared to be a feast. She'd found clothes that fit her, simple black pants and a white blouse from the emergency wardrobe he kept for unexpected overnight guests, and her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked professional, competent, but the warmth in her smile was entirely personal. I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of ordering groceries and preparing breakfast. But it was the small touches that caught his attention. Fresh flowers in a simple vase, the morning newspaper folded beside his place setting. The way the entire space somehow felt warmer despite no change in temperature. No one has cooked for me in my own home before. He gestured helplessly at the scene before him. She always said that the most important conversations happen over shared meals, that food is how we take care of each other. She told him about her grandmother's small house in Portland, about learning to cook on a temperamental old stove that required patience and intuition, about growing herbs in window boxes because they couldn't afford a real garden. Alexander asked, surprised by his own curiosity about her life. I stayed because I thought I could make it work, but the city is expensive, and I was too proud to ask for help. She met his eyes across the table. Until desperation made the choice for me. If you'd told me yesterday that this was where I'd be, I'd have suggested you seek professional help. She arranged furniture to create conversation areas, brought in plants that thrived in the abundant light, and somehow made the vast space feel intimate without losing its grandeur. Fresh coffee waiting when he woke. Meals that appeared at exactly the right times. The way she somehow anticipated his needs without being intrusive. She managed his schedule with the efficiency of the best executive assistants he'd ever had. But unlike them, she seemed to care about the man behind the appointments. Your 3 o'clock canceled, she told him one afternoon, appearing in his home office with that graceful quiet he'd come to associate with her presence. Something about a family emergency. I took the liberty of rescheduling for tomorrow and clearing the rest of your afternoon. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because it was productive or profitable? She moved closer, and he caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed to follow her like a gentle cloud. What did you do for fun before you became Alexander Sinclair, business mogul? Do you still have supplies? Hidden behind boxes of old files and forgotten equipment, he found the easel he'd bought with his first real paycheck, the paint sets that had once been his most prized possessions. The paintings were good, not masterpieces, but filled with a passion and joy that the current Alexander seemed to have lost. Why did you stop? Arya set up the easel near the window, her movements efficient despite her obvious lack of familiarity with art supplies. Paint something for me. But as he stood there, brush in hand for the first time in over a decade, he found himself really looking at her. Not as his employee, or even as the beautiful woman who had appeared in his life like something out of a fairy tale, but as a person who had somehow managed to slip past all his defenses and remind him of who he used to be. But what emerged on the canvas wasn't just her physical beauty. It was the quiet strength he'd seen in her from that first night, the way she seemed to find wonder in simple things, the gentle determination that had led her to his door in the first place. I haven't done this in so long, he said, surprised by how natural it felt, how the familiar motion seemed to unlock something in him that had been sleeping. It shows, Arya said, moving to stand behind him, and he was acutely aware of her presence, the way her breath stirred the air near his ear. Not the skill, that's still there, but the joy. It's like watching someone remember how to breathe. Arya told him about her dreams of opening her own catering business, about the recipes she'd collected from every job she'd ever held, about her belief that food could bring people together in ways that nothing else could. Alexander found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about the fear that had driven him to succeed, about the loneliness that had followed him even as his empire grew, about the way he'd convinced himself that needing others was a luxury he couldn't afford. Success isn't worth much if you have no one to share it with, Arya said, as they cleaned brushes together, their hands occasionally touching as they reached for the same supplies. No one is better alone, Arya said firmly. Some of us just get better at pretending we don't need anyone else. She wasn't just his employee or even his friend. She was becoming essential to his sense of home, to his understanding of what his life could be. Alexander had built his fortune by avoiding emotional investments, by keeping relationships transactional and manageable. But Arya was neither manageable nor transactional. She was warm and real and utterly herself, and she was making him want things he'd given up on years ago. The next morning brought the first real test of their evolving relationship. Alexander woke to find Arya on the phone in the kitchen, her voice strained with barely controlled emotion. "I've never missed a payment, never even been late." Arya ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, her shoulders rigid with tension. Apparently, she took out a second mortgage last year to pay for her medical treatments and… Arya's voice broke. "She never told me. She's been struggling alone, and now she's going to lose the only home she's ever known." "How much does she owe?" "Consider it done," he said simply. "Your grandmother raised an incredible woman who offered to wash dishes for a stranger just to have a safe place to sleep. That kind of person deserves to keep her home." He could smell her shampoo, feel the warmth of her body against his, and for the first time in years, holding someone felt like the most natural thing in the world. But admitting it would change everything, would acknowledge that what was happening between them had moved far beyond employer and employee. Alexander found himself smiling as he listened to Arya's side of the conversation, the joy in her voice worth more than any business deal he'd ever closed. She was quieter, more reserved, as if the magnitude of his gift had created a distance between them that hadn't existed before. Arya pushed food around her plate, her usual appetite absent. "Alexander, what you did today, it changes things. I've never had someone just solve my problems like that. It's overwhelming. Now I owe you something I can never repay. How do I live with that? How do we…" She gestured between them, acknowledging what neither had explicitly stated. "How do we figure out what this is when the balance is so unequal?" He'd spent his entire adult life in relationships where money was either the primary attraction or the primary barrier. Women who wanted his wealth, women who were intimidated by it, women who tried to prove they didn't need it, but never someone who simply saw past it to the man underneath. What if money wasn't a factor, he asked. What if we met somewhere else, some other way, and neither of us had more or less than the other? What would this be then? Then, it would be two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, when they both needed to remember what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. "Let's pretend I'm just a man who paints watercolors, and you're just a woman who makes incredible food. And we met because the universe decided we needed each other." Alexander introduced Arya to his world gradually, taking her to gallery openings and charity events where her natural grace and genuine warmth made her the center of attention in ways that had nothing to do with her connection to him. But it was in the quiet moments that their bond truly solidified. Mornings when they cooked breakfast together, Arya teaching Alexander techniques her grandmother had taught her while he shared stories of business deals and boardroom battles. Evenings when they painted together, Alexander's style loosening under Arya's encouragement until his canvases began to show not just technical skill but emotional truth. "You're different when you paint," Arya observed one evening as they worked side by side, her own attempts at watercolor surprisingly good for a beginner. She paused in her painting to study him. "Is that who you were before you became… this?" "I just forgot for a while." "I know," he replied, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was acknowledging. "I know this is complicated. I know there are a dozen reasons why this shouldn't happen. You've given me enough to start over anywhere I choose." Alexander had kissed many women in his life, but never like this. Never with the sense that he was coming home. Never with the feeling that he was exactly where he belonged. Arya's lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like the wine they'd been sharing, and something sweeter. Something uniquely her. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said. Alexander discovered what it was like to have someone who wanted to know about his day, not because it affected business deals or stock prices, but because she cared about his happiness. Arya learned what it felt like to be treasured, to have someone whose face lit up simply because she walked into a room. They were careful to keep their relationship private, both understanding instinctively that what they had was too precious to expose to outside scrutiny before it had time to fully develop. But within the sanctuary of Alexander's penthouse, they were simply two people falling in love with a completeness that surprised them both. Alexander felt his stomach clench with sudden fear. In his experience, conversations that began that way rarely ended well. What is it? But the thought of meeting the woman who had raised Arya, who would see right through him to determine whether he was worthy of her granddaughter's love, terrified him more than any of those challenges. That you're kind and generous, and that you make me want to be the best version of myself. That you see me, really see me, in ways no one else ever has. I didn't tell her that you're worth more money than some small countries, or that you own buildings I can see from this window, or that people literally write articles about your business decisions. She reached across the table to take his hand. I didn't tell her those things because they're not why I love you. Arya, Alexander began, but she held up her free hand. But since it's out there, yes, I love you. I love the way you paint, like you're afraid the colors will run away if you don't capture them fast enough. I love how you listen when I talk about recipes like they're the most important things in the world. I love that you gave my grandmother her home back without thinking twice about it. And I love that you pretend to need me when we both know you managed just fine before I showed up. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her palm. I love you too, Arya Valencia. I love your strength and your warmth and the way you make everything better just by being there. I love that you offered to wash dishes for a place to sleep and somehow ended up saving me instead. The small house was everything his penthouse wasn't. Crowded with memories, filled with the comfortable chaos of a life fully lived, warm in ways that had nothing to do with expensive heating systems. Tiny and sharp-eyed, she studied him with the frank assessment of someone who had lived long enough to see through pretense and had no patience for anything less than honesty. So you're the man who saved my home, she said, gesturing for him to sit at a kitchen table that had clearly been the center of family life for decades. She poured coffee from a pot that had seen better days, but the brew was perfect, strong and rich and somehow tasting like home. Arya tells me you're successful. Success isn't about money, young man. It's about becoming the person you were meant to be. Are you successful in that sense? In Eleanor's small kitchen, surrounded by decades of family photos and the lingering aromas of countless shared meals, his usual deflections felt inappropriate. Always could see straight through to what mattered most. She leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. But what I want to know is what you're teaching her. She needs someone who teaches her that she deserves to be taken care of too, that love isn't just about what she can do for others. Eleanor's eyes were fierce with protective love. Can you do that for her? She makes it easy to want to give her everything. In this family, we show love through food. And if you're going to be part of this family, you need to know how to speak the language. Alexander found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't since his own parents died, remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. How can you tell? But looking at Arya, remembering the weekend they'd just shared with her grandmother, thinking about returning to his penthouse that no longer felt empty because she was there to fill it with life, the answer was surprisingly easy. He delegated more responsibilities to his capable team, discovering that the empire he'd built was strong enough to thrive without his constant oversight. With financial security no longer a constant worry, she began developing the catering business she'd dreamed of, using Alexander's kitchen as her testing ground and his connections as her first clients. But she insisted on building it herself, accepting his support but not his money, determined to succeed on her own terms. I'm not proving anything to you, Arya replied, not looking up from the delicate sauce she was preparing. I'm proving it to myself. He'd spent years building his empire partly to prove he was more than the scared 19-year-old who'd inherited nothing but debt and doubt. But watching Arya work with the same fierce determination he'd once felt, he realized something important. Success shared was infinitely sweeter than success achieved alone. Alexander woke one morning to find Arya pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, her face pale with worry. "She's had a stroke. We take care of family." Alexander held her hand, offering what comfort he could while making discreet calls to ensure Eleanor would have the best possible care. But when she saw them together, her face brightened with a smile that made the machines around her bed seem less intimidating. He'd been called many things in his life: brilliant, ruthless, successful. But no one had called him "my boy" since his own grandmother had died when he was 10. Over the next week, as Eleanor recovered with the stubbornness that had carried her through 8 decades of life, Alexander watched Arya navigate the complicated world of medical decisions and insurance paperwork with the same grace she brought to everything else. But he also saw the toll it took on her, the way she tried to carry everything alone. "I can handle it," Arya insisted, but her voice cracked with exhaustion. When Arya woke to find everything arranged, she looked at him with eyes that held tears of gratitude and something deeper. "It's not keeping score or expecting payback. It's just doing whatever needs to be done because the people you love matter more than anything else." Eleanor insisted on teaching him more recipes, claiming he needed to know how to properly feed Arya when she got too focused on work to remember. The older woman also shared stories about Arya's childhood, painting a picture of a girl who had always been wise beyond her years, always putting others first. "Her parents were so wrapped up in their own drama after the divorce, and I did my best. But I was working 2 jobs to keep us afloat. That girl learned early that love meant being useful, being needed." He'd seen the pattern in Arya's behavior, the way she anticipated his needs, the way she seemed to measure her worth by what she could contribute. It was a survival skill he understood intimately, having developed his own version after his parents' death. "I'm learning to show her she's worth loving just for who she is," Alexander said. The crisis had stripped away the last pretenses between them, leaving something raw and real and unbreakably strong. "Not for what you've done for me or my grandmother. Not for the security you provide or the life you've given me access to. I love you for who you are when it's just us, when you let yourself be vulnerable and real. You were worthy the night you let a stranger into your home just because she needed help. Everything else has just been you remembering that, diminishing either." But instead, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning as they cooked breakfast together, Arya humming unconsciously as she flipped pancakes, while Alexander watched her with the kind of contentment he'd never known existed. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words slipping out without any of the careful planning he'd intended. "Not because it makes financial sense, or because it's the logical next step, but because I can't imagine a morning without you humming in my kitchen, or a night without you falling asleep in my arms. Marry me because you make me believe in forever. Promise me we'll never stop seeing each other the way we do right now." They were married in Eleanor's garden, with the woman who had raised Arya officiating through a minister friend and a small gathering of people who had become family by choice rather than blood. As Alexander watched Arya walk toward him through the flowers her grandmother had planted decades ago, he thought about the night she'd appeared in his lobby, desperate and determined, and somehow exactly what his life had been missing. He'd thought he was offering her shelter, but she'd given him something infinitely more valuable. She'd given him home. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift away, Alexander and Arya found themselves alone in the garden. The string lights Eleanor had insisted on casting a warm glow over everything. In the distance, they could see the Seattle skyline, the buildings Alexander owned just pinpricks of light from this perspective. "Just one," Alexander said, and Arya's smile faltered slightly until he continued. "I regret that it took me 35 years to find you." "Well, when you put it that way, I regret that it took a rainstorm and complete desperation to make me brave enough to knock on your door." As they swayed together in the garden where Arya had learned to love cooking, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on genuine care and connection, Alexander realized that his greatest success had nothing to do with money or power or any of the things he'd once thought mattered. His greatest success was learning to love and be loved in return, to build a life that was rich in all the ways that actually counted. And it had all started with a young woman who'd been brave enough to ask for help, and a man who'd been wise enough to say yes, not just to her request for shelter, but to the possibility of something more beautiful than either of them had dared to imagine. The story of how they met would become family legend, told and retold at dinner parties and holiday gatherings, embellished slightly with each telling but never losing its essential truth. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary kindness, and sometimes the best thing we can do is open our door to a stranger in the rain, because you never know when that stranger might turn out to be the person who was always meant to be your home. Years later, when friends asked Alexander what had made him stop that night, what had made him override building policy and his own careful habits to let a desperate stranger into his sanctuary, he would always give the same answer. I recognized something in her that I'd lost in myself, and I wanted it back. I just had to be brave enough to ask. And they lived, if not happily ever after, then something better. They lived fully, deeply, and completely together, building a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered most, proving every day that the best investments aren't measured in dollars, but in the courage to love and be loved in return. Alexander's business faced a hostile takeover attempt from a consortium of competitors who saw his recent happiness as a sign of weakness, a softening that made him vulnerable. The attacks were personal and vicious, with tabloid articles questioning whether his marriage to a former homeless woman indicated poor judgment that extended to his business decisions. Arya found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never wanted, photographers following her to the grocery store, reporters calling her catering clients to ask invasive questions about her past. The woman who had once valued her privacy above almost everything else suddenly found her life dissected in publications she'd never even heard of. "Maybe we should have waited," she said one evening after a particularly brutal article had described their love story as a calculated publicity stunt designed to humanize Alexander's corporate image. Alexander asked, looking up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing legal strategies to combat the takeover. "For the world to give us permission to be happy?" He closed the laptop immediately, giving her his full attention. "You are worthy of this. You're worthy of everything good in this world, and if other people can't see that, it's their loss, not yours." Arya, who had always moved through the world with quiet confidence, began second-guessing herself. She questioned her business decisions, worried that clients were hiring her because of her connection to Alexander rather than her talent, and started editing herself in ways that broke his heart to witness. The turning point came during a charity gala where Alexander was being honored for his philanthropic work. As they walked the red carpet, a reporter shoved a microphone in Arya's face and asked, "How does it feel to know that people think you're only here because you're sleeping with the honoree?" "I'm here because I've seen firsthand what it means to need help and to receive it from someone who expects nothing in return. And I'm here because I'm proud to stand beside a man who uses his success to lift others up rather than tear them down. As for sleeping with him, I'm not sleeping with Alexander Sinclair the billionaire, or Alexander Sinclair the philanthropist. I'm married to Alexander Sinclair, the man who remembers what it feels like to be afraid and alone, who paints watercolors when he thinks no one is looking, and who learned my grandmother's biscuit recipe because he wanted to make me feel at home. That's the man I fell in love with, and that's the man I wake up beside every morning." Social media exploded with support for her dignity and grace under pressure, and suddenly the narrative shifted. Instead of being seen as Alexander's charity case, she became recognized as a strong woman who had found love in unexpected circumstances and refused to be diminished by others' skepticism. But more importantly, the moment reminded Arya of who she truly was. Not someone who needed to prove her worth to strangers, but someone who had always known her own value and simply needed to remember it. The takeover attempt ultimately failed, partly because of Alexander's business acumen, but also because the attackers had fundamentally misunderstood him. They thought marriage had made him soft, but it had actually made him stronger. Fighting for the life he'd built with Arya gave him a clarity of purpose he'd never had when he was fighting only for himself. "You reminded everyone who I really am," Alexander said, pulling her close, "including me." Arya's catering business flourished, with clients who hired her because her food was exceptional and her attention to detail unmatched. She specialized in intimate gatherings and corporate events where her personal touch could make the difference between a meal and an experience. Alexander, inspired by Arya's entrepreneurial spirit, launched a venture capital fund focused on supporting small businesses owned by women and minorities. It wasn't his most profitable investment, but it was his most meaningful, giving him a way to use his resources to create opportunities for others, the way Arya had created opportunity from her own desperate circumstances. They bought a house in the suburbs, not to replace the penthouse which remained their primary residence, but to have a place where they could host Eleanor for extended visits and where they could eventually raise the family they both wanted. The house was nothing like Alexander's usual sleek aesthetic. Instead, it was warm and welcoming, with a large kitchen that became the heart of their entertaining, and a studio where Alexander could paint with natural light streaming through oversized windows. "It's perfect," Arya said the day they closed on the property, standing in the backyard where she was already envisioning the garden she wanted to plant. Alexander was still driven and successful, but now his ambition was tempered by perspective and purpose. Arya was still nurturing and generous, but now she understood that taking care of others didn't require sacrificing herself. The third year brought Eleanor's 80th birthday, which they celebrated with a party that filled the new house with laughter and stories, and the kind of multi-generational joy that Alexander had never experienced. Watching Arya move through the gathering, ensuring everyone felt included and cared for, he marveled at her gift for creating family wherever she went. Always has been. Even as a little girl, she could make anyone feel like they belonged. Later that evening, as they cleaned up after the party, Alexander found himself thinking about the family they wanted to start. They talked about children in abstract terms, but watching Arya with the neighborhood kids who'd been invited to the party, seeing her natural ease with the babies and toddlers, made the future feel suddenly very real. He asked as they loaded the dishwasher together. He was so focused on business, on providing financially, that he never really saw me. What if I do the same thing? You know what it feels like to be unseen, which means you'll make sure our children never feel that way. Good parents aren't born knowing how to do everything right. They're people who care enough to keep trying to do better. He asked, instantly alert. Are you happy? He researched prenatal care with the same intensity he'd once brought to hostile takeovers, interviewed obstetricians like he was hiring a new CEO, and transformed one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery that looked like something from a high-end design magazine. You know the baby won't care if the curtains match the rug, Arya said one afternoon, watching him debate between two shades of yellow that looked identical to her. I want everything to be perfect, Alexander replied. And something in his voice made Arya realize this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about creating the kind of childhood environment he'd never had, giving their child every possible advantage and comfort. It will be perfect, because it will be ours, Arya said gently. Because this baby will be loved and wanted and cherished. The rest is just details. Arya found herself remembering her father's absence after the divorce, the way she'd learned to be self-sufficient because there was no one else to depend on. Alexander wrestled with memories of feeling like an obligation, rather than a joy to parents who were always focused on the next business crisis. Arya asked one evening as they assembled a crib that had come with instructions apparently written by someone who had never actually built furniture. What if we're so focused on giving this baby everything we didn't have, that we don't give them what they actually need? Present and engaged and willing to figure it out as we go. Their child wouldn't need perfect parents, they would need real ones, people who loved them enough to keep learning and growing and trying to do better. Isabella Rose Sinclair was born on a snowy February morning, arriving 3 weeks early with a set of lungs that announced her presence to the entire maternity ward. Alexander, who had faced down boardrooms full of hostile executives without flinching, found himself shaking as he held his daughter for the first time. She's so small, he whispered, afraid to move lest he somehow damage this perfect tiny person who had instantly become the center of his universe. This was love, not the earth-shaking, transformative love he'd found with Arya, but something deeper and more primal, an instant reorganization of every priority he'd ever had. That I understand now why people say having children changes everything, Alexander said. 5 minutes ago, the most important thing in my life was making sure you were okay. Now it's making sure both of you are okay, forever. The eyes to see what's really important and the chin to go after it. Alexander, who had always prided himself on his efficiency and control, discovered that babies operated on their own schedules and had their own priorities, none of which aligned with business meetings or quarterly reports. He learned to conduct conference calls while bouncing Isabella to sleep, to review contracts during 3 a.m. feedings, and to find 20 minutes of peace in watching his daughter discover her own hands like they were the most fascinating objects in the universe. You're a natural at this, Arya said one morning, finding him in the nursery at dawn, painting while Isabella slept in her crib nearby. She's going to grow up knowing she's the most important thing in your world. He turned down opportunities that would require extensive travel, restructured his schedule to be home for bedtime stories, and discovered that some of his best business ideas came during long walks with Isabella in her stroller. Arya's catering business evolved too, specializing now in family-friendly events and celebrations that honored the importance of bringing people together around food. She wrote a cookbook based on her grandmother's recipes, dedicated to Eleanor, who taught me that love tastes like home, and Isabella, who reminds me every day why that matters. "Do you miss it?" Arya asked as they sat on their terrace, the city lights twinkling below them like fallen stars. The freedom to be spontaneous, to travel on a whim, to have conversations that aren't interrupted by someone needing a diaper change or a snack. Alexander reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "We didn't know we were incomplete. Neither could have imagined then that such a simple request, 'Can I wash your dishes for a place to sleep?' would lead to this. A love that had survived public scrutiny and business crises, a family that filled their home with laughter and chaos and joy, a partnership that made both of them better versions of themselves. The fear, the uncertainty, the moments when they'd had to choose trust over safety. Those were the experiences that had forged something unbreakable between them. Easy love might have been more comfortable, but it wouldn't have been as deep or as real. As the evening wound down and they prepared for another night of interrupted sleep and early morning cuddles, both of them felt the quiet satisfaction of people who had not just found love, but had built something lasting from it. Their story would continue, with new challenges and joys, with more children perhaps, certainly with more years of choosing each other every day. But it would always begin the same way, with a young woman brave enough to ask for help, and a man wise enough to see past the request to the person making it, with kindness offered freely and accepted gratefully, with the simple recognition that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come, disguised as ordinary human decency. And in years to come, when Isabella asked how her parents met, they would tell her about the rainstorm and the lobby and the offer to wash dishes, but they would also tell her about the real magic, the way two people can save each other simply by being willing to be saved, the way love grows not from grand gestures but from daily choices to see and value and cherish each other, the way sometimes the best thing you can do is open your door to someone who needs shelter, because you never know when that someone might turn out to be your forever home.